Hey students, welcome to our last chapter review. This is for chapter 9 of The Great Gatsby. Let's dive on in. So, writing 2 years after Gatsby's death, so it's taken Nick 2 years to kind of gain perspective and sit down and write about the things he has experienced. Nick describes the events that surrounded the funeral. Swarms of reporters, journalists, and gossip mongers descend on the mansion in the aftermath of the murder. Wild, untrue stories, more exaggerated than the rumors about Gatsby when he was throwing his parties, circulate around the nature of Gatsby's relationship to Myrtle and Wilson. Feeling that Gatsby would not want to go through a funeral alone, Nick tries to hold a large funeral for him, but all of Gatsby's former friends and acquaintances have either disappeared, Tom and Daisy, for instance, move away with no forwarding address, or refuse to come, like Meyer Wolfshine and Klipspringer. The latter claims that he has a social engagement in Westport and asks Nick to send along his tennis shoes. Outraged, Nick hangs up on him. The only people to attend the funeral are Nick, Owl Eyes, a few servants, and Gatsby's father, Henry C. Gatz, who has come all the way from Minnesota. Henry Gatz is proud of his son and saves a picture of his house. He also fills Nick in on Gatsby's early life, showing him a book in which a young Gatsby has written a schedule for self-improvement. So how long does Nick wait to finally write about the events of the Great Gatsby? So he waits 2 years, and that's because the events that he accounts have so deeply affected him that he needs time to process and heal before he can actually put them down on paper. And so who is rumored to have been Myrtle's secret lover and murderer? It's Gatsby. So it says in here that journalists, reporters, gossip mongers, they all descend upon the mansion. And that's because they believe that what happened is essentially that there was a love affair between, like a love triangle between Gatsby, Wilson, and Myrtle. And Gatsby killed Myrtle and Wilson killed Gatsby and then himself. So that's what everyone believes. And that's going to be like the lasting legacy of Gatsby. So considering all the things that Gatsby wants, what he will forever be remembered for by the general public is as like someone who has affairs and kills people. So a terrible person, when we know that's not the case. And so that is what the rumors are. And just like when Gatsby is alive, his death is surrounded by rumors and gossip. And who attends Gatsby's funeral? So there's some people that we expect to be there who aren't. Daisy, primarily. But there's also other people. So Klipspringer was a friend of Gatsby's. He played music at Gatsby's parties. And when he finds out that Gatsby's dead, the only thing he really has to say is he asks for his tennis shoes to be sent to him. And so this kind of, once again, is a criticism of the 1920s, particularly its sense of materialism, where Fitzgerald felt like in the 1920s, people cared more about things than about other people. And so that's kind of demonstrated there. And Nick is furious that Klipspringer would say something like that. The people who do come to the funeral are Nick, Gatsby's friend, Owl Eyes, who actually admired Gatsby because he felt as though Gatsby was actually not fake like everyone else. A few servants, and then also Gatsby's father, Henry C. Gatz, who is really the only person around who knew Gatsby before he became Gatsby, when he was still J. Gatz. And it's really interesting how proud he is of his son, and how he wants to take pictures of the house because he realizes how far Gatsby's actually come. He knows where Gatsby started, and he knows where he ended up, and he's proud of the things his son accomplished. And also showing Nick the schedule for self-improvement goes to indicate the fact that Gatsby had always been the way he is. He always wanted to improve himself. He always wanted to achieve something. And it makes us wonder, had he never met Daisy, where would he be? Like, what could he have achieved if he didn't focus his achievements around loving a woman who was very flawed? If he had focused his achievements on something else, maybe his life would have been different. And so how does Henry C. Gatz feel about his son? I just talked about that. And so that's that. All right, let's move forward. So, sick of the East and its empty values, Nick decides to move back to the Midwest, which is where he was born and raised. So remember, he lived in the Midwest until he kind of like shipped off he went to college at Yale, and then he shipped off to war. And then when he came back, he was dissatisfied with the Midwest, and he moved to the East Coast to become a bondsman. And that's when he fell into the crowd with the Buchanans and when he met Gatsby. So he breaks off his relationship with Jordan, who suddenly claims that she's become engaged to another man. Just before he leaves, Nick encounters Tom on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Nick initially refuses to shake Tom's hand, but eventually accepts. Tom tells him that he was the one who told Wilson that Gatsby owned the car that killed Myrtle, and describes how greatly he suffered when he had to give up the apartment he kept in the city for his affair. He says that Gatsby deserved to die. Nick comes to the conclusion that Tom and Daisy are careless and uncaring people, and that they destroy people and things, knowing that their money will shield them from ever having to face any negative consequences. And so where does Nick go after Gatsby's funeral? He goes home. He goes to the Midwest. What does Tom admit to when bumping into Nick on a New York street? So he admits to kind of what we already talked about in the previous chapter. He admits to telling Wilson that Gatsby was Myrtle's lover and essentially framing Gatsby. And Tom clearly does not feel bad about it at all. He feels as though Gatsby deserved it, even though Gatsby was not the one who killed Myrtle. And this speaks even more to the fact that Tom really is a villain in the story. He has no redeemable characteristics. He's fully an antagonist. And he then says, it's very much like Klipspringer's shoes. He says that what was really painful for him was having to give up his apartment in New York City. Not the fact that Myrtle died, not the fact that his wife had an affair, not the fact that Gatsby and Wilson died, and that he was linked to all this death and pain. What really bothered him was that he had to give up his apartment. And so again, this goes into the idea of materialism and just how flawed people were in the 1920s, particularly the upper class of old money, like the Buchanans. And so how does Tom feel about Gatsby's death? I just kind of talked about that. And what insult does Nick issue to people like the Buchanans? He calls them careless. And so while this doesn't seem like a terrible insult, Nick means it as the deepest insult. So it's essentially the idea, if you think back to earlier in the novel, really early, Tom and Daisy come to the East Coast from Chicago. So they lived in Chicago. And in Chicago, the reason why they left was because Tom had an affair with a maid and got into a car accident, and they were deeply embarrassed. And actually, I think that happened prior to Chicago. So all that happened, and then they moved to Chicago, and then they moved from Chicago to New York. And essentially what I'm trying to get at is that there's this impression that Daisy and Tom move someplace, mess things up, they get in car accidents, they ruin people's lives, and then they move someplace else where no one knows about it. And so they're careless people who are bored with their lives because it's super easy, and so they ruin things to entertain themselves, and then they go someplace else so they don't have to deal with the fallout. And their money allows for them to do this. They never get caught, they never get into trouble, they never have to pay consequences, whether it's legal or social. And Nick hates them for it. And he considers Jordan to kind of be a part of that lifestyle as well, which is why he doesn't want to see her ever again. And so he calls them careless because they destroy things. And so this fits into Fitzgerald's criticism of the 1920s and just how classist of a decade it was, where the upper class stomps all over the lower class and never has to pay any repercussions for it. If you think about it, who dies in the book? It's Gatsby, who has a lot of money, but he's new money. He tries to get into the kind of this old money world, and and they destroy him. You think about Wilson and Myrtle, who both are trying to move up the social ladder. Myrtle hopes that she'll marry into it by marrying Tom. Wilson hopes that he can like honestly earn it by running a business. And again, they're destroyed. They're destroyed by Tom and Daisy. They're used up and killed. And so we really see Fitzgerald's opinion on the ruthlessness of this very, very wealthy old money class and how they treat people who are outside of their class. And yeah, it's pretty severe. It's pretty critical. So Nick muses that in some ways this story is a story of the West, even though it has taken place entirely on the East Coast. Nick, Jordan, Tom, and Daisy are all from west of the Appalachians, and Nick believes that the reaction of each, himself included, to living the fast-paced, lurid lifestyle of the East has shaped his or her behavior. Nick remembers life in the Midwest full of snow, trains, and Christmas wreaths, and thinks that the East seems grotesque and distorted by comparison. And so essentially Nick makes a connection here between the East Coast, specifically the city life like New York City, as being linked to kind of this materialistic, classist lifestyle where people don't care for one another. And he contrasts that with the Midwest, where he perceives it as being a much better place. And if you have done the Romantic period unit, there's something very transcendental about this. The idea that the society of the city ruins the individual and makes them a worst version of themselves, while the Midwest, which is full of natural landscapes, brings you closer to nature and makes you a better person. It's very transcendental. And so there's an interesting connection there that you might want to explore further in your project. It's really interesting. And it kind of informs the idea of what green might symbolize, which we'll talk about in a minute. So why does Nick claim that the story is one of the West, even though it takes place in the East? So the West, it's a story of the West because it's praising the West. The West symbolizes opportunity. If you are nothing, you can go out to the West and actually make something of yourself, because there are endless green fields where you can explore your own identity without it being drowned out by the city. And so the book is in criticism of the East and in praise of the West, even though the West is barely mentioned until the end, because all the characters are ruined by the East. How has the East affected all the characters? Why has it affected them this way? It's ruined them. And so it's the idea that Daisy and Gatsby fell in love when they were living further west. Nick felt happier when he was living further west. Tom, I don't know, I feel like he was probably always a crummy person, but he was probably a little bit better when he lived out west. It's the idea that when they came to the East, it brought out all of their flaws. It brought out Nick's indecisiveness. It brought out Gatsby's delusions. It brought out Daisy's selfishness. It brought out Tom's aggression, and it made them all worse people. So I know this is going to take me longer than 2 minutes to explain, so we're going to stop here, and then I will see you over in video 2, where we will talk about the very last pages of the book, because they're quite important. So I want to make sure that we understand them before we call it quits. All right, I'll see you in our next and final video. Bye.